Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest Citrus People and Robots Initiative lecture series. And it's a great pleasure to have our speaker here today. He's actually a very old friend, and I've known him since I was a graduate student.
I think,
and
weren't you an undergrad at Penn before that?
I was an undergrad at Penn.
I met you there.
Oh my God, okay. Thanks to Retina. But actually, well, let me introduce him first, which is that what I just learned actually was that he has his undergrad in operations research as well as computer science from Johns Hopkins. Then he went to Stanford, where he studied with Rujna and McCarthy into the great era of robotics. And Shaky was around at that time.
It was more Lou Paul and the Golden Arm, but
right.
Arm.
Vic Scheinman.
Yeah.
So he was around then. Then he went to IBM and played a key role in the development of a robot programming language, AML. And then around that time, he was making contributions to a lot of work in manufacturing and got interested in the topic of computer-assisted surgery. In particular, as I recall, it was a cutting of the socket for hip replacement, and had these fabulous results. And that grew and was put into clinical trials. And it was right around this time that I got to meet him. I got to know him better because my advisor, Matt Mason, had published a very important paper called LMT, Lozano Perez, Mason, and Taylor, and it was about fine motion planning with robots. And if you haven't read it, I know you all have, but if you haven't, definitely read it. It's a fantastic paper about using compliance to guide robots to do complex assemblies and motion planning. And he then left IBM and went back to his alma mater. So he went back to Johns Hopkins, where he formed an entire major group on computer-assisted surgery, and has gone on to build that program. It's really recognized as the top in the world. And he's also had a number of patents, 48 patents in robotics. He is always, whenever you attend a talk and you see from the back of the room Russ Taylor's head near the front, you know that there's going to be, his hand will be the first to go up with questions. And they're always great questions. I mean, this is one thing I admire in anyone who asks good questions. Rujna has this property too. But if you can do it, it's a real skill. And so I want you to please think of a good question, really incisive, probing, hard question for him as soon as he's done, to return the favor that he's done to so many of us over the years. So please welcome Russ Taylor.
Well, look, thank you all so much. The origins of this talk actually are in a 10-minute talk I gave last year in London at the Hamlin Symposium on Medical Robots. And they wanted someone who was an old guy to kind of give a retrospective, and I did, and then later got asked to enlarge it, and so you guys are about the fourth victims, but I keep trying to update it, because it's yesterday, today, and tomorrow. There are all the usual disclosures to make, and so this is very important to realize. I have some commercial ties. Also, I'm the director of the Laboratory for Computational Sensing and Robotics, which grew out of the Engineering Research Center on Computer Integrated Surgery we had, that Regina was one of our key advisors. This is a little out of date. We do something over over $5 million a year in research, and it's a fairly large center now where our biggest limitation is actually space. And I'm kind of admiring all these space I see. Maybe we can steal some. But I just, okay. Maybe we can both go find a billionaire. My talk and my work for actually over my entire career has really dealt with systems that are partnerships between people, technology, and information to change processes. And in this case, my main focus for almost 30 years now has been in healthcare, interventional medicine. And so this is really to remind us that it really is this three-way partnership that is the key. My first work was, as Ron mentioned, in orthopedic surgery, where the goal was to very accurately prepare the bone to receive the femoral component of an orthopedic implant. And later, the company, it was spun off. The first surgeries were actually on dogs. One of the surgeons we worked with was a veterinarian whose patients were the family pets of movie stars. And so this was the first surgery that he did. And this was the first human surgery at Sacramento Hospital, Sutter Hospital. And the company was spun off, went through several vicissitudes, and now exists down in the South Bay as Think Robotics. But again, here's this process. There's technology, the robot, there's imaging and planning all in one integrated process. You could think of this as surgical CAD/CAM. And again, this is from one of the first surgeries. And basically, the robot acted like a machine tool, but there were a lot of problems both with safety and in registering it. The robot is very accurate, and the big danger in this kind of robot is not that it's going to go crazy. It's going to do exactly the right thing in the wrong place. So the registration and the validation of the registration and the monitoring was really one of the key challenges. You can see, compared to the standard process, which is a broach, a manual broach, it's much more precise. And one of the key things is the robot would never break a bone, whereas the standard process, in some large percentage of cases, they do have fractures. Well, over the years, one of the things that we spent a lot of effort is in finding better ways than putting some pins into a patient's leg and finding them with the robot in and a CT scan. And in this case, and we still have a lot of active research. This is from one of my grad students to find from a small set of x-rays either a patient-specific model or based on statistics to guess what the patient might have looked like if we had taken a CT. Here's some work that is actually ongoing now, where the goal is to locate a bone fragment in what's called an osteotomy. Rather than replace someone's hip, especially if they're a young person, often you have a condition, for instance, dysplasia, where the hip socket is too narrow or too shallow. And you get small dislocations, and over time that destroys the cartilage, or you get a big dislocation. So what they can do is they cut the pelvis and rotate the socket so you're less likely to get that. And the surgeons don't like to use all of these fancy tracking and navigation systems. And so the goal is, can we do it all just with x-rays? And so here what we're doing is we're trying to locate that bone fragment from x-ray images that are really, frankly, pretty terrible. Now, one of our current research projects in all of medical image registration, there's a dirty little secret. People run their algorithms on lots of test cases and give you the statistics of the errors and say, this is therefore very good. The problem is the computer doesn't know whether the case it's got in front of it, where it thinks it knows the answer, is the right answer. So some of the current research that my student Rob is doing is to see, just from the information he has in the images, can he tell you the probability that the answer is right? And he's making some very good progress with that. But that is one of, I think, the key problems in this whole field. Another thing you can do, we do a lot of work with taking lots of x-rays and making statistical models of how anatomy varies. You've got work statistically modeling muscle right now. And one of the things you can do with that is you often have partial data. You may only have part of a CT scan, or you may just have some x-ray images, or combine those with your statistical model and make a very good guess as to what that patient would, the parts of the model that you don't have from direct images would be. This is, in an osteotomy, this can be very important because you're trying, especially with young women, you want to minimize the X-ray dose in the pelvic region, but you still need often to get very good information around the hip sockets. Yeah.
We are having difficulties to get X-rays.
Mm-hmm.
That, they are dangerous, blah, blah, blah. How do you get along? Under what circumstances can you justify X-ray?
Well, in this particular, first, in a lot of cases, we're looking at ways to use ultrasound. But in this case, the standard of care is using lots and lots of X-rays. And so the argument is we can use fewer X-rays. And let me come back to that during the discussion period. I hope I can leave myself some time for discussing. So this is an example of that where we take, gray is what we know. So we've taken right through where the hip sockets are and just a little bit up at the top of your hip. And what we're able to do with some other processing is we're able to get, this is the error map, at least for this patient, of the error. And it's all, aside from a few places that don't so much matter for biomechanics, is all good enough for doing that procedure. I'll get to robots in a moment, but there's an awful lot of cases where what we're really just trying to do is a partnership between the surgeon and information and ways of getting information. Now, traditionally, all of your surgery is, all that information fusion is done up in the surgeon's head. But of course, we have a computer that can synthesize all of that information, and as I was alluding to just a few instances of that, do biomechanical planning or whatever online and begin to give in real-time decision support to that physician, which you can present in various ways. I've actually hidden a few of my slides here, but let me go back and talk to another very early thing we did. This I was actually working on while we were working on Robodoc and this is a system I was working with this fellow, Court Cutting, wonderful name for a surgeon, who does craniofacial osteotomies. And he was all for me to get him a robot to help position these bone fragments relative to each other after he'd cut a patient's face apart and he was rearranging the pieces. I talked him out of that. I said, robot manipulating bone fragments around optic nerve, maybe let's see if we need to. And we came up with this picture where this was from very early days, where you would make a statistical model of a patient. You'd take the individual patient and you could figure out how to cut up all the bones of the face to rearrange them to give that patient a more normal appearance. And there are a bunch of trade-offs that you would have to do. A perfect plan that you can't execute isn't so perfect. So the other part of the process involved implementing a surgical navigation system to track these bone fragments in the operating room, and a very simple passive manipulation aid and some other human-machine interfaces to help the surgeon do the job. So this is what part of that system looked like in our lab. Regina, you may remember Jonas Funda. I hired him, and this is one of the things he worked on. Yeah, he went over to the dark side and got an MBA, but yeah. Oh, I should go back. I mean, maybe I could offer to him to have Funda Hall, but if you still have his contacts, I would like to catch up with him again. In any case, this is what the system looked like in our lab. Here is then there was eventually, after a number of hiccups where we wound up donating all of the equipment to NYU, who then Dr. Cutting was able to use the equipment, or actually a subset of it, to get this into the operating room. And this was, I think, the second case he did. So this is what it looked like in the operating room. And, oh, I don't have the good gory slides here, but you'll have to believe me. They were pretty gory. Moving on, this is some work that one of my grad students, who's now actually works at Intuitive, did, where here the goal is transoral surgery for tumors in the base of the tongue. And now you would probably want to track more of the anatomy, but here, the idea is she's registered, and this is where the lingual artery is, and you have guides to the tumor. And the studies, and we fused with fluoroscopy, and for some secrecy reasons that had to be blanked out. I think I could show it now, but this sort of thing is going on. There's also a lot of work with head-mounted displays that, for reasons of time, I'll skip. This is some current work that we're doing. This is today and near-term tomorrow, where what we're trying to do is to provide assistance to a sinus surgeon in understanding anatomy and knowing anatomy that he can't see. And intraoperatively, the goal is to do this without a bunch of fancy tracking stuff to the patient's head. And so what we're doing is we're basically registering. We do structure for motion from just endoscopic video, which gives you sparse 3D points up to scale, and then we can register those together with observable contours to the endoscopic video. And you don't have a robot. This can be done either with a robot, which is very precise. I'll show you a robot we're going to use for this in a minute, or freehand. Yeah, a structure for motion is a standard computer vision thing. It's basically video slam. Well, you have an endoscope, and they're typically rigid, and they're stuck up into the nose, and then they typically have a tool as well, and they're working up in your nose. And of course, you want to know if you go too far, there's about a millimeter of bone between the back of your sphenoid, or back of your sinuses, and the bottom of your brain. And your carotid arteries are also right there, and you kind of want to know where those are. Well, right now, the surgeon knows, he thinks he knows, but the goal is to do this direct video to CT registration, and now we can show the surgeon where things are in video. So this is a surgical this is a navigational display. This is not being used clinically yet, but this is where we're headed. So this is a conventional display. Here's kind of where the endoscope is pointing, and this is what the endoscope is seeing. So if you've done this registration, you can do this. Now, here, most surgery, you have a preoperative scan. In just a clinic, when you come in to have a guy look in your nose, you don't, but he still might want to get some context. So one of the things that we're working toward is building statistical models of the sinuses. My student Ayushi Senna is working in this. And if you can use the statistical model to help you segment the next patient. And this becomes part of our registration pipeline. I've just showed you a little more data. But now what happens is, if you don't have that, maybe this is what you have. You get your structure for motion and a statistical model, and we're getting pretty far along, but then make a patient-specific model, a best guess.
you elaborate on the statistical model? What is it?
Right now, we're using something that's probably too naive. We're using basically PCA model, linear PCA on, for each patient, what you have is a mesh. When you use the when you use the mesh to help you segment, you get vertex correspondences, and then you can tweak all of the meshes to improve the correspondences. We have papers on how to do that. And then so far we're doing linear PCA, which for sinuses is probably not ultimately the right thing, because your nose, there are different topologies with different people. And so parts of your nose are doubtless some kind of a Gaussian mixture model at least. And so this is something to look at in the future. But for what we've been doing so far, and the parts of the nose that we've been looking at, linear PCA works pretty well. This is one of the things that we've done is, when you're doing registration, a lot of people with these multimodality registrations have a bunch of arbitrary weights you put on each modality. I don't like that at all. So we've been going back, and originally the work of my student Seth Billings, and now been pushed further by Ayushi, we've said, okay, for feature-based registration, you take all of your images and you extract features from them, or any other positional information that you might have, any other features, and for each feature you put a noise model. So you can compute the probability that feature in this image actually corresponds to feature in that image. And then we're doing, basically it's a straight Bayesian estimation, where now you can use from your statistical model, and like I say, right now it's just PCA weights. You can also get a prior probability on a shape and the posterior probability on the matches, and you combine them all to get a most probable registration. And this is what we're seeing in one part of the nose. You're seeing how it's converging. Now the point about this is we can make the parts of the nose we can see, but just for context, we can tell you, and we can even tell you something about the probability, assuming the patient is at all normal, of the structures that you can't see, and that gives the surgeon some context. The other thing that these statistical models do is you can do label propagation. What that means is I have a lot of information associated with the basic mesh of my statistical model. If I match that to an individual patient, all of that other historical information and anatomical labeling and so forth propagates. We were talking earlier about some of this, let me actually talk about robots. In addition to RoboDoc, I gave a talk years ago at one of at SAGES, which is it's the big gastroendoscopic surgeon conference, just at the year where laparoscopic cholecystectomy had really taken off, and suddenly there were a lot of people, and a number of us, I got interested, could we use a robot to help, along with, there were several other groups doing similar things at the same time. We developed, so at IBM we developed this robot. It was called the Lars, and probably, and it was intended to be very precise. It could do stereotactic things. It was quite accurate. And it could also manipulate endoscopes and video endoscopes. Probably the feature, it seemed to me to be pretty obvious, and here is the famous pumpkin demo. We got the thing assembled about Halloween of '93, and so we had a pumpkin. Was this mechanically constrained isocenter, and that's probably gotten huge citation. To me, it was just sort of obvious, but anyhow, we did it. And you see that structure in many, many, many robots, probably most famously in the Da Vinci robots. And here are some of the various research robots that we've done over the years. There was the Lars. This was something that we did at IBM before the Lars that was all a bad idea, but it was huge, and we did it. This is I'll talk about a few of these other systems later. This was, I may not talk about this. Here are the ideas. This is an isocenter robot for driving needles. But the key thing is we had this fiducial structure on the needle driver, and so from even one slice, one CT slice, you could know exactly where the needle was, and you could use that basically for visual servoing in things like CT-guided biopsies or CT fluoro-guided biopsies. Another theme what was the first demo that you would ever do with a robot that had a force sensor? You'd shake hands with it. Well, we tried that when the veterinarian came to visit us at IBM, and after that, that was the only way he wanted to interact with the robot physically. So it's very simple admittance control, and I've used it for years and years and years in robots. Again, you're beginning to see more and more robots using this rather than teleoperation, and I'll talk about a couple of our experiences. One are these eye surgery robots, where here, retinal surgery, you worry about hand tremor and we'll talk later a bit more, but these robots, again, use this. There's a force sensor. It works like power steering in your car. You push on the tool, the robot feels it and follows your hand, but of course it's the robot really doing the motion, so there's no hand tremor, and also the robot can do things like enforce safety barriers or even take over and do something on its own. This robot up here is actually was developed by my PhD student Kevin Olds for head and neck microsurgery. It uses the same control principle, and let me just mention, here's an example where we were combining that with imaging. So here we built a poor man's, this is a sinus case, where we built a poor man's navigation system. Here for the navigation, we were actually just using implanted fiducials because the emphasis is on the virtual fixture. You have to insert instruments and remove them many, many times during a procedure. And the idea here is you could define a path either from the images or just hand teach it. And then the robot, if you just push on it, would steer itself. And that could either be hard or soft. And here, Regina, you can kind of see what, here's the endoscope. His hand is over there.
Did you have to pay any attention to selecting the right focus, like back drive?
We did. In this case, my own bias here is do not have back drive ability. This robot has a special kinematic structure. It's a parallel delta. And the motors, just to have it responsiveness, rather than lead screws, we use ball screws, so it's a little bit back drivable. But in my opinion, for this kind of robot, you want your compliance to come from the force sensor, and if you pull the plug, it should sit there. So that's what we did. Now that was Kevin's system. I got to say, on a personal note, Kevin very tragically died very suddenly in August, and that was a huge blow to all of us. He'd been working with us and a startup company that was commercializing that robot. This is actually, Kevin had designed this system here. And this is what the system looked like at an otolaryngology show. That's still a non-clinical system from last September. And we're continuing to work. Full disclosure, I'm consulting with the company, and they're also sponsoring research at Hopkins, where our research goal is not to do the FDA version of the robot, But this is a platform technology. Surgical robots are often platforms. The Da Vinci robot is a platform. Once you have the basic function through FDA, now you can begin to enhance it, in our case, by adding smarter tools, smarter sensing, integrating navigation. And once the basic system is there, we think that will be a lot easier. And we've got about 4 or 5 surgeons attendings and 2, well, there's a resident and a fellow who spend a couple days a week with us. And I gotta say, that's the way to have these kind of partnerships. I'm taking longer to talk than I'd planned. I may run over, I hope not. But so another challenge is getting high dexterity in very small spaces in surgery. And this actually was, I think, the first CTR, high dexterity CTR design, this thing that I came up with Mosaicking, where we had submitted a proposal that almost got funded and was shot down by a person who will remain nameless, who said it would never be worth anything. But and this is a system with a continuum robot, basically only bendy metal. This is a system that Nabil Simon and I developed at Hopkins, and this is, of course, Bob Webster's concentric tube robot. And these systems have especially both Bob and a little bit later Pierre Dupont have really pioneered, and now they're students, the use of these very small concentric tube robots. What you do is, if I have 2 pieces of bendy metal, and if I rotate them relative to each other, they'll straighten out. So by rotating and sliding the metal relative to each other, you can get a lot of shape control, but the control is really complicated. And Bob Webster, who was a Hopkins student, his main advisor was Alison Nakamura, has really, he's now at Vanderbilt, has really done quite a lot, as has Pierre Dupont in this. This one here, what you have is, if you have 2 pieces of bendy metal held parallel, pull on one and push on the other, they'll bend. With 3 pieces of metal, I get 2 bends, and so what we have here are 3 tubes, and running through each tube is a wire, and down the middle is an actuator. So this is smaller than a Da Vinci with higher dexterity. So here's another concentric tube robot that, or another snake-like robot that we've developed at Hopkins with the Applied Physics Lab, which is Fixtures. And here the application, the idea is it's a tube. This one happens to be 6 millimeters outer diameter, 4 millimeters inner diameter, through which you can deploy rotor-rooters or shavers or cutters of various sorts. And this initial application, the idea is to clean out a lesion behind an osteolytic lesion behind an orthopedic implant. What happens is you get wear particles get around behind the implant, often working in through those screw holes, and set up a reaction so the bone turns to mush. Well, now what happens is the implant bone has grown into the implant everywhere except where it's turned to mush, and eventually either the bone will break or the implant will fall out, and it'll be very hard to make a repair. So the idea here is you come in a minimally invasive way, you clean out the glop and refill it with cement. And we've still not to the point of doing that clinically, but are doing cadaver studies and the like. Here's something else we've been doing that I think has a lot of prospect and may get to clinical use sooner. We're just submitting NIH proposal on this. There's another condition called avascular necrosis, where basically the ball of your femur is dying from the inside out, and it's going to collapse or die. And so the idea, this is the wrong place you do it. You actually come in that way in the bone, and you can drill out, clean out the bad part and then refill it with cement. And this would be done under X-ray guidance. Here's another. This is this is, I think, a 3mm snake for accessing and hand actuation, although you can also drive it from a Da Vinci robot. In this case, for a condition for basically curating out a tumor in, I think it's called the petrous apex. It's sort of back in here. Oh, and yeah, and here's the thing where we mounted it on a Da Vinci. I want to save a little time. Robot enhanced sensing. You can use the robot as a platform for deploying and moving sensors around. This was an early master's thesis where we had an RCM robot manipulating ultrasound probe. More recently, well, still a long time ago, we had an NIH, it was the last SBIR that Intuitive Surgical was allowed to have, where we developed with them an ultrasound probe that could be manipulated by just as a surgical tool. And then there were various sort of augmented realities and assisted behaviors. We'd also done some work with handheld drop-in probes, which I think is a better idea. Tim Selkudian has really driven this idea much further and has done some amazing work integrating ultrasound imaging. This is a case where what we were doing is the robot is doing elastography. The robot is, if you track the speckles, you can, as you palpate, you can compute relative stiffness of tissue. And so you'd guide the robot across the surface of the organ while the robot would add this motion. And so this was, again, this was my student Billings. I wanted him to do his PhD thesis there, and he wound up doing that Bayesian thing instead. But we're starting to go back to that. This is, here, this is just this cooperative control, but what you're not seeing here is there's a separate force sensor, so you can simultaneously sense hand force and tool to tissue force. And what this means is that we can control the force on the patient quite accurately and get much more repeatable ultrasound exams. Mm-hmm. Can you go back one slide? Okay.
How did you input did you have a separate ultrasound generator?
Oh, no, that's a conventional ultrasound probe. We had access to the, I think we may have gotten that to the RF data, but it's conventional. This is the laparoscopic ultrasound probe that Da Vinci developed with us, that Intuitive developed. Well, it's just an ultrasound has this system unit. There's a big cable that with lots of wires that comes out to the transducer. And everything in here is conventional, and in this case, that wires all went down here to that, but it's otherwise a conventional ultrasound probe. So it's just, I think here we were using an ultrasonics system. I'm not. Again, other things there are a lot of advantages in using a robot for ultrasound. The biggest cause of occupational disability in ultrasonographers is basically repetitive stress injury. And being able to repeatedly control forces, and also because the robot moves very precisely, you can actually get better imaging. You can, especially if you can do things like synthetic aperture imaging and things like that. This is some other work that Nasir Nawab, who's got a joint appointment at Hopkins, has been doing with people on robotically held ultrasound probe to work with Da Vinci robots in, again, base of tongue tumors. This is another example. I've been usually afraid of cardiac, but this was the thing that we did with intuitive, or with actually with Philips, where the goal is to retrieve a particle that has gotten into your heart while it's beating. The standard therapy is open heart surgery, very major surgery. You have to get that out before it makes it to the lung and kills the patient. The idea is, it's shown here, is to come in through the apex of the beating heart with a snake-like robot and snarf the particle. Pardon? Well, various things. For the experiments, it was metal, so we just used a little magnet. Otherwise, yeah, you have little snares or suctions or whatever. So this was the experimental apparatus. We were using real-time 3D Philips ultrasound. Now, the problem is things move really fast in the heart, and the robot was slow, and to make a really fast robot running around the heart didn't seem like a good idea. So what we realized was there are eddies in there. So if you watch the particle, you can build up a probability map of where it's likely to be, and sort of like a bass waiting for a minnow to swim by, you bring the robot there to wait for it. So it's building up this map. Eventually, it's going to pick a spot about there, and you're going to see the robot come in. Other cases, you may have a couple hot spots, and you pick one. And so here comes the robot. And again, this just had a little magnet at the end, and so it snarfed it. I don't know what Philips finally did with this other than hire my student. MRI guidance for stereotactic procedures in MRI. Julian Yortakita does a lot of work in our lab on MRI-guided robots. This is one example for prostate biopsies and brachytherapy. I can come back and talk longer about these, but I'm just trying to give you some feel of the range of what we do. This was another system that he did with Kevin Cleary, at Children's National Medical Center for shoulder arthroscopy for kids. Again, in MRI guidance. So again, I've already alluded to it. The goal eventually is to put all of these pieces together. And that honestly was the vision from the very, very beginning. And so here I'm going to take a moment and actually show you a few things that we put together from IBM days, and it kind of breaks my heart to see we had a lot of good ideas early. And let me see, that should be narrated by now. Oh, why?
Research Center, we have begun investigating computer-assisted endoscopic surgery.
Can people hear that?
Initial efforts are aimed at replacing the assistant who manipulates the endoscope.
You see, this was even before we built the Lars.
Laparoscopic camera is mounted on the robot, and its output is displayed to the surgeon on a standard monitor. A 45-degree mirror is attached to the laparoscope to simulate a sideways-looking 90-degree telescope.
So all of this is really crude. It was crude at the time, and it will seem cruder now. But
modalities to position the camera relative to the current view of the patient's anatomy. In the current system, information is supplied to the system via a 2D joystick.
that's actually the button out of an IBM ThinkPad. In fact, it is the second one ever built.
One of the most basic capabilities allows the surgeon to adjust the camera's field of view relative to the camera's frame of reference. In this demonstration, the surgeon can indicate...
So this was probably about 1.5 years before we had the Lars built, and we were all ready. One of the key things in controlling these robots is actually doing the kinematic control, because you have constraints, you have safety limits, kinematic redundancies, and kinematic deficiencies. So the way we were building these virtual fixtures was largely by setting up constrained quadratic programming problems that you could solve Well, now we solve them about 500 times a second to do the kinematic control. Let me, just in the interest of time, let me stop this. And this, again, was a very early video, visual. Let me see if I can scan that forward a bit. Where here the idea was to identify a target. The robot would then locate the target by jiggling the endoscope. It now knows where it is and would guide itself down to place a biopsy device or or some other surgical tool deployed through a working channel. Now this is all pretty. We were very proud of it at the time, but it was all pretty simple. Now why? Here's where we are today. Our goal is to make a really smart endoscopic assistant where we can begin to do machine learning methods to try to actually understand how what the expectations of the surgeon are. So and so there is all of these other technical components I was showing, together with a significant machine learning component, and maybe in a year I'll be able to say something to be proud about. There's a PhD student and a master's student working on this.
What is the machine learning going to tell you?
Well, we're trying to learn the rules. We're trying to basically what we're trying to guess is what would an expert endoscopist do? People have done all kinds of things. There are people who track eye gaze. There are people who track the tool. Well, do you really want the robot doing that? Probably not. So you need to also understand something about the context of the surgery, and some of the work that Greg Hager is doing in language of surgery problems, we're also wanting to recognize all of that. It's a big effort, and we're just really trying to start to get the pieces together. I'm hoping to get something that's at least useful enough for a couple applications initially, and then again try to make it smart enough. And again, as the clinical version of that head and neck robot is deployed, we'll have a platform for doing our clinical trials. Microsurgery, this goes way back from shortly after I joined IBM. We've been working with ophthalmology. And the goal is basically to find ways to use technology to overcome the various sensory motor deficits that the surgeons have. I am going to go over. Do we get kicked out of the room? No. Okay. Well, I'll impose on you all as long as you want.
Let me just let's fix the time because I don't want everyone to just sort of trickle out on you. Maybe 5 minutes. Is that good?
Well, I've got about 10 minutes more material if I go fast.
Okay. Let's.
Okay. In this case, one of the things you do is you're trying. I've distracted myself too much by telling war stories as we're going, but here what we're doing is we're building up a mosaic map of what we can see in retinal surgery as an eyeball is manipulated under the microscope. And then you can annotate that map, in this case we're registering a preoperative fundus image, and then you can do image injection to overlay that onto or any other information onto the live view through a video microscope in this case. The forces in retinal surgery are an order of magnitude smaller than a human can feel. And the only practical way to sense them between the tool and the tissue is to build force sensors into the part of the tool which is less than 1 millimeter in diameter that goes into the eye. And so over years, we've developed optical fiber force sensors that we've built into surgical tools that give us basically millinewton tool tissue interaction forces.
Are these standard FPG sensors?
Right, yeah, they're FPG sensors. And other things you can do, though, by putting additional sensors on the part of the tool that's outside of the eye, you can also know the tool to scleroforce, which is really important in controlling the robot. And you can do things like this. Here, we're manipulating the eyeball, and the robot is just following the tool. One thing, if you've got two robots, you also, for safety, don't want them doing that. So there are a bunch of things that we're able to do here. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to skip forward. We've also shown that by controlling the tool to scleroforce, you're actually better able to do tasks inside the eye. You can also build optical. In this case, this is an OCT sensor that we can build right into the surgical tool, and that can be used both for structure and spectroscopy. And the other thing we can do with that, I think I probably don't have the slide here, is we can also control the tool to tissue distance and avoid collisions. Here was some other work where in this case we had built sensors into where we're controlling the deployment point for a cochlear implant inside cochleas. This is a freehand tool where you're sensing the tool to tissue distance, and what that can do for you is it allows you to control the depth that you're, say, injecting. If you want to inject, say, gene or genetic material or drugs into particular retinal layers, you've got to control the depth very carefully. And so this is a freehand tool that does that, where the work is led by my colleague Jen Kang. So here, one of the things that is absolutely vital is to build a community so we can all share. One of the great things in the early days of robotics is everybody had a Puma. It was a terrible robot, but we all had it, except at IBM we had something different. For medical robotics, for years in the ERC, our goal was to establish a set of common software platforms that could be used for all of our different surgical robots. What happened is Intuitive Surgical then donated basically the parts out of their first generation of surgical robots to universities without IP restrictions. And a number of these systems are now around the world, all running control electronics designed at Hopkins and built now at Worcester Poly, and software basically primarily developed by us. And we have an NSF NRI grant with Worcester Poly and University of Washington to enhance the software. I'm just going to talk briefly about one project that we've been doing. This is an NRI that I've been doing with where the goal is basically information fusion of taking what we call it complementary situational awareness. You have a model of the patient and the environment and the tasks that you're using to help you control the robot, but as you're manipulating, as you're doing things, you're getting more information, and that's enhancing your model. And just one piece of that is with palpation strategies. If you do continuous palpation, you can build up a stiffness model. And so we've been using Gaussian processes to do that. There's a problem, though, that as you get more and more data, the computation goes slower and slower, so you get one update every 10 seconds, which isn't so good. What Preetham rethought the problem and realized that with some different way of organizing the data, he can now get estimates that are as accurate as those, but run at 50 hertz at basically video frame rate. So, and there's a bunch of other things. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip. Here's another project. Ron, Ken, have you seen this? Okay, here what we're doing is it's sort of visual servoing to manipulate soft tissue as we cut it. and also if you wanted to say put a needle on something as you're manipulating, so you're manipulating tissue and finding the desired cutting plane. And the point here is, as you cut the tissue, the properties change radically, and so we're adaptively estimating it. It's really the work of Farshid and Zori Wang, who was a visitor but is now back at Chinese University of Hong Kong. I want to just close on two other things real quickly, and then I'll. This is the picture I started with, and a lot of what we've been talking about is how do I do an individual intervention better. But the other thing to realize is we have all this data, and someday we know the outcomes. And if I save that data, I can begin to do statistical process control to basically figure out better ways to treat the next patient. And one example is some work I've been doing with Todd McNutt at radiation oncology, where initially what we did is we were looking at the records of all the patients who we'd previously treated at Hopkins. In this case, it's head and neck cancer radiation therapy. And we're able to come up with some planning rules or some ways of planning the procedure that basically allowed us in some fraction of cases to give the same dose to the tumor, but reduce the dose to surrounding critical structures. And equally important, we were able to the process involves iteratively solving problems a dosimetrist sets up until there's one he's happy with. Instead, by using our method, usually the first time out you get a good solution, and with one or two tries, you get something the physician says is as good or better than what we had been doing. And so this is all in our clinical workflow now. Now what we're doing, I don't have slides on it, is what we're trying to do is understand how the spatial distribution of dose within an organ helps predict outcomes and predicts complications. Because right now, you plan these based on what fraction of an organ has what amount of dose, but you don't believe that one part is necessarily better than another, and that's wrong. You see, in the end, what you really want to plan your dose to optimize predicted outcome, rather than optimize the machine settings to provide a particular dose. So that's ongoing work. I mean, that's tomorrow. There's a lot of similar work at Hopkins. This just is one slide from my colleague Jeff Sewardson, who's looking at spine data. So if you guys are interested in spine, you might want to talk to Jeff. This is some work just to remind us of one of the outcomes of Greg Hager's Language of Surgery project, which is basically machine learning. In this case, this is some work of now, I guess, postdoc Anand Malpani to basically develop an automatic coach for helping score and train surgical residents learning how to do. Sewardson, S-I-E-W-E-R-D-S-E-N. If you'll send me email, I'll make all the introductions in the world, Rosina. This is the last thing I wanted to talk about just because it's fun. This is a project where we've been working with a company that makes a malaria vaccine that is clinically effective. You make it out of the salivary glands of infected mosquitoes. And so they have to get the salivary glands out of the mosquitoes, and they do it one mosquito at a time with tweezers and a hypodermic needle. So they came to us and said, could we build a robot? I said, not now. Let's understand the problem. And initially what we did is we came up with a very simple system of fixturing that basically you sort the mosquitoes into these little nests, and then you can cut their heads off all at once and process them 20 at a time. So this is actually right now being re-engineered to go into ISO 9000 production. And now what we're doing, and I should just mention that this undergraduate, Caitlin Schneider, who I was telling you earlier, was the main designer of this. Or I'm sorry, no, that was the other one who Tim sold. It was Mariah Schrum. I must be getting tired. So Mariah Schrum, I don't know if she's applied here. She's applied at Hopkins. I hope we wind up being able to keep her, but she should have all the opportunities in the world. She's also, we now have a project to build a robotic version of that, and she's doing the machine vision part of that, as well as helping us design the robot. So this has always just been a fun project, and I thought I'd mention it, and now I can close. Where are we going? If I look, human-machine interfaces, we're going to have more interoperative decision support. I think these immersive environments, more and more. Shared control. The robot is a tool, and the robot can do some things better than the human. The human can do some things more intelligently than the robot. And I think there's going to be a lot of this shared control before we ever get to something that's truly autonomous. And there needs to be a lot of ergonomic optimization. If I'm looking at the technology, really it's all of the above. Almost anything you could imagine. Sensing, directed energy devices, smart tools, almost everything down to micron-sized devices. And in information, I think one of the most important things is that first item. We need to focus on the entire treatment cycle rather than just the perioperative piece. It's just like in manufacturing, you need to include design, supply chain, fabrication, test, and everything. The same is actually true in hospitals, which should be run more like factories. Modeling of patient state, statistical models for decision support, metrics. How can you relate technical endpoints that we engineers can measure with clinical endpoints, and training? So this is the slide I've finished every talk for about 20 years with, and it really is to remind us that I kind of changed careers from something that might have been more lucrative for me to this area because I really wanted to do something where you could see the results of what we do directly affect people. And I think this three-way partnership really has huge capability, potential to couple machine capability to human judgment and sophisticated information to improve quality of care and ultimately produce better outcomes and more cost effectiveness. And I apologize for running over. I should have probably rehearsed this a little bit. Okay, well, I exhausted everybody. And let me just thank those people I got a chance to talk to today. It's been a fantastic day. I'm hoping that some things come out of it, like possible RO1s that we could submit together or NSF things. Okay. Well, thank you.